Hi, everybody. Great to see you. Super excited to get started today. I think we have a really exciting conversation ahead of us. And thank you so much. For those who don't know, my name is Jared Gordon. I'm on the TechTO team. If you've kind of been curious about working with us in partnerships or on our newsletter, um, you've probably quite familiar with me. But for all of you who don't know, that's generally what I do. And today we have an exciting conversation put together by the team at MNP. MNP is one of a long-term partner of TechTO that specialize in the areas of accounting and finance. And we've put together an exciting kind of chat around the topics related to. Sorry, can you hear me? I'm getting. Oh, perfect. Okay, sorry about that. Around the topic of going public. And the question would be, there hasn't been an IPO larger than 50 million in something like 280 odd days. So why are we talking about this today? And, the reason being is that it doesn't happen overnight, and it is like a long-term goal of many kind of startups and organizations to be able to participate in the public markets, have a wider shareholder base, have shares and usable for the purposes of acquisitions. And it's not, in order to do that, there are kind of certain regulatory requirements and just kind of, readiness requirements. And you often see companies get punished for these kinds of things. Like you can look at the performance of SPACs. So, companies that have kind of through reverse means become public. And, it's been fairly negative. And part of that is largely driven by their lack of kind of preparedness and readiness for the demands of the public market. So, what we're here to talk about today, and super excited for everyone to join us, is how to get ready. It's not going to happen overnight. So what are some of the early considerations and thinking you can be engaging in early on to help kind of prepare your company? And so to do that, we have three people with us today who, definitely know what they're talking about and are going to walk us through kind of some interesting points of the conversation. The chat is, as always, on the right-hand side. Looking forward to your questions as well. Feel free to use the emojis and also to introduce yourself. Will Avery is a partner at MNP's Assurance Services Group. He's a long time kind of TechTO fan partner and a great resource to us and our TechTO, members on issues related to kind of going public accounting and finance. And he's joined by Sud, who's a partner at MNP's technology, media, and telecom practice. So, Will, why don't we bring you up to the stage and you can kind of introduce the conversation for the day. So, thanks, Alex. Hi, Will.
Hi, thanks, Jared. First of all, happy to be here. Thank you for everyone joining. Welcome to today's, what I'm referring to as a fireside chat, presented, of course, by TechTO and MNP. Today's chat, as Jared alluded to, we're aiming to introduce some of the key considerations for being ready for a public markets liquidity event. We'll have an open discussion here with our panelists and then a Q&A period where hopefully we can answer any questions you have or expand on any additional topics, of course, time permitting. I wanted to get started today with a quote from one of our panelists, just to keep in mind throughout the discussion. And honestly, this might as well be a mantra for you when the time comes for a liquidity event. The path to a successful go public transition is not a straight one. As Jared mentioned, our panelists today, I myself am the moderator. As Jared mentioned, I'm the public companies leader here in Toronto and a Go Public Readiness champion with 15 plus years of experience in cross-border public company listings in a broad range of industries. And today it's my pleasure to be speaking with one of my coworkers, Saad Sheikh, who is our Toronto TMT leader and a tech specialist working with companies as well, going public in either the US or Canada. We're also joined today by Shamiz Rampertab, CFO of Ascensus Surgical, which takes me to my first question for Shamiz. First of all, can you tell us all a little bit more about your past, present, and future?
Great. Thank you for inviting me, Will. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. In terms of my background, I've always liked the financial end of things. I'm a CPA by background, but I also have some of the science background for the industry that I'm in. But I've been very much focused on the go public capital markets side of things. And that evolved basically because I've been on all aspects of the going public transaction, i.e., back in the day when I was an articling student at another CPA firm, but then also I was on what they call the buy side, the investors that have money to invest in public companies. And then I was also with a number of investment banks in Toronto, 4 different investment banks over my career, both as one of the research equity analysts as well as an investment banker. And then moved over to, I guess, the bright side with the issuers as a CFO, and Ascensa Surgical is my 4th company as CFO. And they all have a certain theme with regards to the preparedness you have to do and the challenges you're going to face depending on what the market environment is. And happy to talk about that as we go forward here. But my experience has been both on U.S. capital markets and Canadian capital markets. In fact, I'd say in the last 5 years, it's more so on the U.S. side than the Canadian side, just because of the nature of the industry I'm in. Life sciences, there seems to be more interest in the U.S. right now than in Canada for life science opportunities.
Certainly, and we always kind of see that ebb and flow, which I'm sure we'll get into more broadly in our discussion. Thank you for that. That's a better intro than I could have given. So, it's good to get people familiar with who you are. That brings us to our second question here. Shamiz, what would you consider those essential elements for readiness?
There are lots of lists out there, and your introduction in that quote, the path to going public is not a straight one. You do have to have a path, you have to have a goal, but just be ready. You're going to have to pivot, turn, swerve, go backwards. And if I were to identify 3 of the top items you need to consider up front, and it's a long list, but just let's focus on 3. The first one is record keeping. Going from a private to a public company. Public companies, you're audited. You're audited by your CPA firm, but you're subject to regulatory scrutiny by a lot of other parties as well. So record keeping as a private company sometimes gets put in the back burner. You need to clean that up. You need to focus in on it. You need to get all your documents lined up. And you have to change those attitudes towards record keeping as well. And that doesn't happen overnight. It takes a while to convince people that, forward me that contract and make sure that contract is signed and dated. Simple things like that, but they can be hiccups that could slow down your going public process, because a lot of people will be pouring through the various documents that you have. And the record keeping is accounting record keeping too. Make sure you have, in terms of expenses, you have all the documents lined up. Because you are going to have some kind of audit that needs to be completed of your financial records. You may not have had that exposure or experience before. And then, so with regards to record keeping, you have a whole slew of other agreements as well. You need to have those agreements in hand. And some of them are not necessarily economic agreements, but things such as, your management employment agreement, maybe agreements with regards to your board members and their roles and so forth. And all of your minutes of your meetings need to be pulled together. And the third item is really with regards to your cap table. This is what investors are going to spend a lot of time with. They're going to be interested in your business, but they're also, and it surprises people when they kind of dig through your cap table and say, oh, you're too expensive and so forth. You really got to kind of analyze your cap table and get all those documents that support that cap table in hand. And part of that whole process of a cap table and agreements, you need really good security counsel. And you might get references. You've got to be comfortable with that security counsel, because there are different experiences, different qualities of security counsel. I've had some good ones, I've had some bad ones. I've had to change security counsel in the middle of that go public transaction as well, because it just wasn't working for us. And you got to be prepared for that. So I guess, if I were to give an analogy, don't get married to your advisor. You can change the advisor if it's not working for you in the management team.
Yeah, and just when we've had previous discussions on this, the overall theme, be it debits and credits, getting out of the shoebox sort of method of keeping receipts and evidence. It extends through to all those agreements. And, if you're maintaining poor attitudes towards record keeping, it's often a warning sign of what else might you be ignoring. So I like your perspective on that. Oops. Saad, over to you for our next question. When you've worked in the past with Shamiz, what did you see that he and his team did well that made them successful in working with you?
Yeah, hi everyone. Very nice to meet everyone. Yeah, it's a great question, Will. So Shamiz and I worked together on a past transaction where we helped the company go public in Canada, as well as cross-list into the U.S. So Shamiz kind of hit it on the head in his previous response, but what I will say is Shamiz did a phenomenal job of hiring the right people. And what I really mean by that is, when he joined that company, his initial mandate was to build out a finance team. And, Shamiz and I had, numerous conversations about what that person would look like, what was the right skill set to have in place. And, he ultimately found a controller and did a great job of really putting in the plan in place, having the right processes. And what that really led to is, from an audit perspective, it just came across as if they were prepared, right? Everything was ready to go. All the evidence, all the reconciliations were available to us. The cap table that Shamiz mentioned, always an area of focus as auditors. All that information was readily available, and any questions that we had were easily answerable. So that made the whole process a lot smoother. The third point I'll make there is just the collaborative aspect of the audit. Shamiz and I have a great relationship, and the ability for us to just jump on a phone call and discuss an issue. I remember when we first got engaged, with the audit itself, one of the first things that we did was we, invited our tax advisors just to talk about, what the scope, what the plans were for the company, and how the structure from a tax perspective was optimal. And those are little things, but they go a long way because, it avoids some of the pitfalls that could happen later down the line. The last point I'll make is just the responsiveness of Shamiz and his team. Like I mentioned, the ability to be able to, get on a phone call, pick up the phone and just call him about an issue, discuss a certain thing related to the audit. It was never a problem. Things were moving fast, and we were all kind of working towards the same goal or the similar goal. So, Shamiz, maybe I'm not sure if I took any words out of your mouth, but anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to add some things that, so some of your viewers might be thinking, oh, he just bulked up his finance team. By no means. That's the last thing any CEO wants to see happen. I was very particular about the candidates and the skill set we were going to bring on board. And whenever you talk to investment bankers, they kind of when you hear the horror stories of delays in going public, the investment bankers are quick to say, "Yeah, it's the auditors that slow it down." And I'm always looking to be upfront and deal with the rate limiting factor in any process. And that's what the investment bankers typically kind of say is the rate limiting factor. And my experience with Saad and MNP was we identified issues upfront. I didn't let him kind of find it. I know what the issues are, so I brought it up front. So in their planning of work they needed to do and advice they can give us in terms of helping us prepare for that audit, it was brought up front because no one likes surprises at the end. That just delays everyone. And if you have a surprise at the end, that's really, really problematic because that could delay your transaction. And when you're going public, you got to take advantage of that window. Time is of the essence. And like right now, it's not a good capital market, but guess what? A year and a half ago, it was a hot market and you should have been prepared for that hot market. So I guess what should you be doing right now? You should be preparing now for that next hot market. Is it going to be next month, next year, the year after? I don't know. No one truly knows, but you need to get prepared. So my auditors I view them as my partners in all of this. And one other thing I'll just mention as an aside, I've had investment banks always say, well, you're going public, you want to go NASDAQ or you want to go NYSE American. You really need to have one of the top four audit firms doing your audit. And, that's 3 times in terms of cost. There are ways around that. And we dealt with that. Saad and I worked with that with the investment banks to give them comfort in terms of the experience of the CPA firm we have with PCAOB, US GAAP, NASDAQ, NYSE American. Even though they hadn't heard, these US bankers hadn't heard of MNP, we got them over that hump. It didn't happen overnight, but we got them over that. Because frankly, I didn't want to, triple my audit fee costs just because I'm going with, PwC or an E&Y. Not that they're not good, that they're all good, but I would rather keep my capital that I have in the bank right now, or the capital I'll raise in my going public transaction, for helping the fundamental business grow as opposed to dealing with administrative expenses. That's just a pragmatic part of me that comes out.
Thanks, Shamiz. That's certainly a feather in Saad's cap there. I loved what you guys hit on, the collaboration, because certainly that's what's going to lead to discussing those issues and addressing them up front. And any public listing process, it's always going to be a high stress pressure cooker environment. So, fortune favors the prepared. There's no reason to really rest on your laurels and set yourself up for added stress. No need to set a spark to the tinderbox. So I really like that aspect of it. This is a question really aimed for both of you. Shamiz, you underwent a cross listing. What factors into the decision of where to list, and what pitfalls would you warn people to look out for?
That's a really good question, because once again, there are lots of lists out there that tell you, what you need to check the box to list TSX Venture, TSX Mainboard, NASDAQ, the different tiers within NASDAQ, or the different tiers on the NYSE. And you really have to come to terms with where your company is today and how you plan on growing it over the next 3 years, and 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. And one of the companies that I was CFO for, I joined them early on. It's called Zomedica, and we did list them on TSX Venture because we felt it was a much better quality board than trying to go OTC bulletin board. And we had a number of investors in Canada that wanted us to have a public listing, and they recognized TSX Venture as a good first step. But ultimately, we wanted to have a US senior listing. But we didn't meet the criteria to get that listing at that point in time, but we met the TSX Venture criteria, and it also gave us the opportunity to further meet all of our public company reporting obligations in a low risk platform, if you want to call it that, because TSXV is a lot more forgiving than NYSE American and so on. So it allowed us to prepare with the goal. We knew what we had to do to meet the criteria for NYSE American, and it gave us that time to meet that criteria. And just to kind of conclude on that whole cross listing, after a couple of years on NYSE American, we actually delisted from TSX Venture because we had a really good listing and good volume on there, and the Canadian investors could easily recognize and appreciate the NYSE American listing, but the US investors didn't necessarily recognize or embrace or trade on the TSX Venture listing. And we investigated even, what if we uplisted ourselves to TSX Mainboard? They didn't care. They really didn't care. And I've done this in all my companies in terms of talking to investors about their ability to trade on TSX Mainboard. Some of the institutions can. A lot of them don't really care to, because they say, listen, if you can't get a US senior listing, I've got 100 other companies I could invest in on the US senior listing. So it really is a competition to gain the attention of those US investors. So when we delisted from TSXV, there was actually no hiccup. I know some of the management team was a bit concerned. Some of the board was a bit concerned. There was no hiccup in our stock price when we delisted on that front.
Yeah, and I think Shamiz, the access to capital itself, I think that's always a an important factor, right? For some industries, what we've seen is, the access to capital in the U.S. might be stronger as opposed to Canada. Life sciences as an example, like there's a lot of money in the U.S. that's related to life sciences that we see. So it's important for companies to really figure out, what really, their market is, and where the capital is, right? Because that really kind of dictates where you want to go public. Like you mentioned, there's requirements for each of the exchanges that you have to meet, but it's also important to understand, which exchange will give you access to that capital.
Yeah, that's a great point, Saad. And, we often see, as I alluded to earlier, the kind of ebb and flow. 1 minute division, a certain industry will be hot in Canada and maybe cooled off in the US, but then those tides can shift, and you just got to have your finger on the pulse when the moment comes as to where ideally your financing is coming from and who you want to partner in that respect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Will,
the other point there is, sorry, Shamiz, go ahead.
I just want to add to that. We were talking about Canada versus US, but I remember even, I've been always life science focused. When Europe was a hot area and Canadian companies were listing on, the London Stock Exchange. So you gotta be aware of where the money is and kind of react to that and take advantage of it.
Yeah, and I think it's, the other point I would make there is, we're talking about readiness today. The idea is to be ready so that you can capitalize or make a move or make a pivot if needed, right? So the whole point is for companies is to put together the resources, to have a plan in mind, so that they're ready when the time comes. If you want to cross list, you can do that. If you want to, perhaps cross list and then delist like Shamiz did with Zomedica, there's a possibility to do that. Europe is also a possibility. You just want to make sure you know what the rules are, and play within those rules so that when the time comes, you're able to kind of put your chips on the table, be able to kind of execute on that strategy.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Shamiz, you actually mentioned this earlier with the relationship with MNP. As you change jurisdiction, your auditors have these different requirements. And, in this case, that was actually a huge advantage for Saad being somebody you can work on both sides of the border. So, I just to tie that all together, I think that was a wonderful point and something that certainly was a benefit to you in your case.
Yeah, there's enough work to do. The last thing I wanted to do is change auditors in that process as well too. So it allowed us to focus on what's going to be really value add to the business.
Saad, in working with your clients, what are the most common avenues you see to a public listing?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I mean, I think there's likely three of them that we come across, which are the three main ones. I think the first one is the traditional IPO. What that really means is, a operating company that essentially files with an exchange, files a prospectus in order to go public. And in the U.S., that's a registration statement. It's the equivalent of that. So, typical IPO, what everybody talks about, that's a traditional way to go public. Another kind of way or common avenue we've seen in Canada as well as the US over the last couple of years is the RTO, or the reverse merger. And what that really means is, you have a company that does a transaction with a shell company that's already public. And what happens to that transaction is that the shell company essentially gives control over to your company. And therefore you become public as a company. There's a term CPC, which is capital pool companies, that's unique to the TSXV. So that's a term that gets thrown around quite a bit. And what that really is a shell company. And the equivalent of that in the US is a SPAC, which is essentially a shell company, but also has, I would say, a lot of financing in place. So these shell companies have already raised, in a SPAC scenario, sometimes even hundreds of millions of dollars, and they have to execute and find a partner to be able to transact with in order to have an operating company being public. The one thing I will mention about the RTO and the reverse merger is it's really, really important for operating companies or all companies to do due diligence on who your partners are in terms of the shell company. Just because you are doing a transaction with them, those shareholders or majority shareholders will become shareholders of your successing company, the company that's listed eventually. So it's important to understand, background checks, who those people are. The last thing you would want in that scenario is, you do a reverse merger with a certain shell, and those shareholders, once the transaction is complete, they end up selling the stock and just moving on. Just comes across as they don't really believe in the vision. They just want to make some money from the deal. That's all. So those things are super important. I think that's something that I advise all of our clients. The third really way to go public, which is a bit indirect, is the acquisition way, right? So you could have a company that's doing phenomenal, growing, scaling, in a really positive way, and you could become an acquisition target. So what that really means is you could get approached by a public company and say, hey, we're really interested in acquiring you and rolling you up into our consolidated group. So we've had some clients where that's happened, and what that really means is your reporting requirements sometimes get enhanced because you have to report up to that group company in order to make sure they're compliant with their disclosure requirements as a public company.
Yeah, that's a great point. And on the acquisition front, even in this TechTO ecosystem, one of the participants in TechTO, and I know Devin Wright was actually a speaker at one of the TED style talks. Turnstile Analytics was acquired by Yelp, and that's an entity that had never previously gone through an audit, and they brought us in for purposes of getting through that acquisition. I liked your point on knowing who your partners are in those shells, because it can, especially in the US, where there's a little bit of often some I would say ambiguity as to your partners. You might not know who everybody is, who's who in the zoo, as they say.
Yeah.
And many people will have seen Wolf of Wall Street. You may be familiar then with what people did in that OTC market. And I know we have actually, unfortunately, seen in our practice some nefarious activity on behalf of the former Shell shareholders, pumping up the stock and then exiting, and kind of leaves current management holding the bag and not looking so hot.
Yeah,
So
what I will add, I was just going to say, as part of that due diligence, what's important is to really kind of sell your vision to that SPAC or shell company, just so that those shareholders really understand and believe in it. Oftentimes there's been transactions where a company will have an LOI with a shell company, but through those discussions they realize, hey, you know what, this other shell company doesn't really understand our vision, is not really on side with our vision, so it's likely not a marriage that would work. So they end up kind of going a different direction. So yeah, I totally agree with your comments there.
Yeah, and Google's your best friend, right? Google some of the people whose names you see in the cap table. If you've really got your back up, even consider going as far as a background check.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
just in terms of like an effort or undertaking, when you consider these different paths, what would you comment as towards like going public versus, say, an RTO? Your experience there.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a question that gets raised to us quite often for companies that are planning on going public. What the best course of action is, or what the most expedited way is. The IPO I would describe is probably the most onerous, just because filing a prospectus, the disclosure requirements, and even the audit requirements are sometimes more extensive compared to an RTO. That's really why I mentioned that we come across the RTO reverse merger over the last few years quite a bit, because it is somewhat expedited. You could perhaps, if you are ready and are in an auditable state and everything's been audited, you could potentially, complete an RTO listing between 4 to 6 months if everything kind of aligns and everything is smooth, and the review process is clean. So those are the two kind of approaches, or the time frames. It's all contingent on how ready you are, how clean the filing itself is, the level of review that occurs at the exchange, your shareholders, the actual reverse merger. If that all process goes smoothly, then perhaps there's an expedited time frame, but it all depends case by case.
Yeah, interesting. And I'm glad you brought up the exchanges too, because one option, it used to not be something that was done all that frequently, but there is now a broader willingness, both in the US and Canada, for those sort of pre-filing reviews where they get everybody together, they look at things in draft, and you're able to more proactively address some of their comments so that you don't get hung up on any of those.
Yeah, that's a
Shamiz,
good point. Like I will say, like we're currently working on quite a few go public transactions in the U.S. and the exchange review itself is fairly onerous, and you wait for their comments. You have to, as a company, respond to those comments. Get the auditors have to get comfortable with your responses, so it just adds additional time frame. And I think that's something that Shamiz and I dealt with on Zomedica as well. When we were cross listing, there was an exchange review and back and forth. It just adds timelines to the transaction completing, but it is a part of the process that you have to respect and go through.
excellent. And Shamiz, in going through that process, is there anything you'd care to layer on there?
You really need to understand their criteria and their rules. Like some people take the position that, oh, our lawyers are going to take care of everything. You really got to own it. Lawyers will take care of a lot, but when you get surprises, what's your lawyer going to tell you? It was in the rules. And did you read the rules? So, or did you read the regulations and so forth? So it really is paramount that you understand that. And it's no different than your investment bankers as well. You hire them, you pay them a lot of money, you pay your investment bankers more money than you pay your lawyers, and you expect them to kind of handhold you through. That's a perception, that's a false perception out there. You got to own it. They're just an agent helping you do your job. That's it. And you need them, unfortunately. You have to use them, but you control the path. And if you're going to deal with any roadblocks, you got to be aware of what those potential roadblocks are. Understand the rules and ask the questions of your advisors, whether it's your lawyers or your investment bankers. You will have from time to time access to the regulators as well, and you will have some meetings with them. And you're a little more on your P's and Q's for those meetings because you don't want to give them more questions than answers to stretch out that review process. So you do spend time prepping for those meetings with your counsel and your investment bankers.
You don't want to accidentally open Pandora's box with the regulators present. Certainly, we've seen most of those conversations led by Securities Counsel, and that just goes back to your earlier point, Shamiz, about making sure that you've got the right person advising you on that front. So this is, again, a question for both of you. When do you feel is the right time for a company to look to go public? And maybe Saad, over to you first.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it all depends on what the company's needs are, right? I mean, I think if you have or require a certain amount of capital down the line, then perhaps you can work towards that particular goal. I think the point I'll make is it's important to have strategy or plan in place and looking down the line, not just 2 months down the line, 3 months down the line, but 6, 8 months or a year down the line to see what your overall plans are. And if you think that going public is on the horizon or one of your options, I think there's a lot of things that you can do today in order to kind of get that plan in motion. Conversations that you can have with an advisor. We talked about the financial statement requirements and the audit requirements. It never hurts to get an audit done. So it's a part of the compliance process or requirement. So if you can get an audit done every single year, with the idea that down the line, if you do plan on going public, you're going to need it anyways. It just makes sense to do that. Even from a tax planning perspective, just making sure that your tax strategy is optimal. Easy for you to go public with no real kind of tax implications. Those are important conversations to have. So it's important to coming back to the question itself. Well, I would say it's important to have a plan in place, but also think down the line. 6, 8, a year down the line, to be able to execute on that plan. Shamiz, I'm not sure if you had anything else to add.
Yeah, it's a complicated question to answer because a right time for one company is going to be different for another company. But if I were to generalize it, all ships rise in a high tide. So be ready for that high tide. What I've said to a number of my CEOs over the years is that, and even when I was on the investment banking side, we can raise money in this market, even though it's a terrible market. But are you willing to pay the price to raise that capital in that market? And you've got to be willing to pay that price. So you can raise money if you truly need it in the public markets, even in a down market like what we're currently experiencing. But be ready for warrants, and that's a dirty word. I'm sure no one likes. Management doesn't like it. Investors don't like it, but the investors getting the warrants love it. But there are good market environments where there aren't warrants, or they're very limited, or they're half warrants, and they're priced really well, or in short term. So just be ready. And if you can take other strategies in order to wait for that right time to go public, meaning mezzanine financing or royalty deals or anything else to give you that cushion, that optionality to either execute tomorrow or execute 6 months from now, hoping the markets will be better. Giving you that optionality is really, really important. So because you only have one chance to make a good first impression when you go public. You mess it up and you end up going public at, I'm just going to throw numbers out there, at $5, and you trade down to $1 a share, you're tarnished with that for a while. So no one wants that.
And Shamiz, maybe just pulling on the thread a little bit more there, what are some of the considerations that you'd have in looking at, like, how much is enough?
How much is enough? Oh,
yeah, maybe a loaded question.
Yeah, no, I love that question, because I've also been guilty of asking this question of my board. How dilution sensitive are you? And the reason I ask that question is I've seen companies where they didn't take all the money that was on the table. Said, "Oh, you know what? We've got enough money." And Saad probably knows the story as well, because he's experienced this. We don't need to take all the money. You know what? We've got enough to hit certain milestones, and when we hit those milestones, then we'll raise money. But you know what? When you hit those milestones, the markets might be down, and so you're not going to get that value creation that you think you deserve. The markets will measure you in however the markets measure you. So my advice is take all the money on the table when it's available, regardless of dilution.
Yeah, and it's sometimes considering those things that might be relatively unknown to you, right? Like once you are a public company, depending on your time frame, talk to your advisors. What are those compliance costs? What do they look like? What have they seen? Just so that you get an idea of where that money's going to have to get earmarked for.
Yeah, and the reality is, because I'm an accountant, so budgets are great tools, but more often than not, we blow through our budgets, right? So you really need more money than what you're quote budgeting for. So take more money if you can get more money, even if it means more dilution. At least you get to keep the lights on and execute on your business plan to fight another day. That's really important.
Yeah,
and markets dry up, right? I mean, it's such a true point. Like, or just over the last year, right? The volatility that we've seen in the market. A year and a half ago, you could have raised money at a different level than you could now. It's just the reality of the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And you certainly don't want to, have the rug pulled out from under you midstream on this process. So those are great points, guys. Saad, you touched on this a little bit, but I was hoping maybe you could elaborate on the financial statement requirements you're referring to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is definitely a question that comes across to us as auditors, probably 9 times out of 10, right? So maybe we'll talk about Canada first. So on the venture exchange, typically it's 2 years audited, which really means a 2-year balance sheet, 2-year P&L, 2-year statement of equity. There's some times where you can qualify as a junior issuer, and if you do qualify as a junior issuer and there are certain requirements, that requirement turns out to be 1 year, which is great. But it's important to make sure that you do qualify, right? So those are discussions that you need to have earlier on in the process. On the senior exchange, which is the TSX or the new exchange, there's 3 years requirement. And then the other thing that requirement that people sometimes forget is your interim financial statements, which are really your quarterly financial statements. So as part of your public filing, you're required to have those quarterly financial statements reviewed by your auditor. It's not an audit, but it is a review. And then the other thing that I'll point to is the scenario that I mentioned earlier, the acquisition scenario, where a company gets acquired by a public company. In that scenario, if the resulting issuer or the resulting company, your operations represent a significant portion of those consolidated operations, then there are certain requirements where you'd have to, or the resulting issuer would have to file a BAR report, which is a business acquisition report. And what that really means is you're required to produce 2 years of audited financial statements for the standalone acquiree. And in that process, there's a significance test, which is important, and they are complicated, so it's important to get that right, because the last thing you would want in that scenario is you're carrying on your business as usual, and then the exchange comes back to you and says, hey, by the way, this represents a significant acquisition for the consolidated group, and you have to have this additional BAR requirement. We've had that happen to us with some clients, and it's definitely a huge surprise and an undertaking to be able to produce those standalone financial statements. So just a word of caution there to make sure.
And a quick way to get cease traded, I might add.
Yeah, such a good point. Yeah. So moving on to the U.S., I think it's 2 years balance sheet and typically 3 years of the P&L, changes in shareholders' equity and cash flow. That can sometimes be a 2 years if you qualify as a small reporting company or an emerging growth company. But once again, there's certain requirements and disclosures and checks that you have to go through to be able to see that you qualify as a small reporting company. So it's important to have those discussions early. Typically, if you are cross-listing like we did with Shamiz and Zomedica, it's the same balance sheet and income statement that we ended up using as part of the Go Public filing in the US for the cross-listing. The interims are similar to Canada. So once again, you're required to have those reviewed by your auditor. And the acquisitions, like I mentioned earlier, there are similar requirements to be able to file standalone financial statements, but the actual thresholds for that significance test are different in the US as compared to Canada. So, once again, it's important to have a securities lawyer involved to make sure that, you're checking against that criteria to see what the actual reporting requirements are. And, overall, just with this response, I would say is it's just important to have these discussions early, just to make sure everybody's on the same page. The requirements are explicit and you feel comfortable with the reporting the way you are, just because, the last thing you would want is a comment from the exchange saying, hey, by the way, I need you to also audit this period. I need you to also complete a review for this period. It's just frustrating and it just slows down the whole process for all sides.
Yeah, great point. And Shamiz, in going through this process, is there anything you'd care to add on the impact here?
Well, yeah, there's a big one. I wanted to interject there on Saad, and Saad was the one that brought it to my attention. Given our, this is the Zomedica experience. Given we were going to list on TSXV under IFRS, and we had plans to ultimately list on a U.S. exchange, and we knew through our capital raising activities, it's going to more and more of our shareholders will be U.S. resident shareholders. Well, guess what? When you get the U.S. listing, there is an actual requirement, which Saad made me aware of, that there's no exemption. There's a requirement. You have to provide your audited financials under U.S. GAAP. So knowing that up front, we actually had MNP provide not only our IFRS financials, but our US GAAP financials. So that really saved us a lot of money, years later when we were doing the cross listing, and saved us a lot of time. So we didn't have to wait for the audit of US GAAP financials to happen. We actually did them as we were doing each of the years or quarterly reviews. That was a real smart move.
Yeah. And, that goes back to the point of making sure you have the right partners that are, I'll say ambidextrous, that they can do both those things and are qualified in both regions. Certainly, it's something that we saw a lot actually happen with some of these major cannabis companies where they did that dual listing, and then same thing, the SEC came knocking and said, hey, wait a minute, you guys might have lost that foreign private issuer status, and now you've got to register. And having somebody that can take those IFRS statements and put them into US GAAP for you, and for somebody like Saad to come in and audit, that's a fairly significant undertaking because there are a lot of different nuances.
Yeah, and it's really hard to do it, 2 years after the fact. It's better to do it at the same time you're doing the regular audit and review engagements.
Yeah, and having a finger again on the pulse of your cap table, knowing your shareholders, knowing the insiders, and those rules, that is an absolute must once you're into that jurisdiction, because once the SECs come knocking, you're already on the back foot.
Yeah, and the other point, and not to get very detailed with the audit approach itself, but the U.S. PCOB requirements from an audit perspective are different compared to the Canadian auditing requirements. So oftentimes when companies approach us saying, "Hey, we completed a Canadian audit in the previous year, we'd like to complete a PCOB audit now," it has significant changes to our extent of testing, the materiality that we use on an engagement. So those are all things that you have to keep in mind. And which is what happened on Zomedica, right? We had to have updated materialities. We had to do more work, more samples, just to be compliant with PCOB. So that's something to kind of keep in mind.
Yeah, and again, in service providers, right? Because even on some of these go publics in the US, you might get away with not having PCOB standards, but then you've got to have an auditor going forward that is familiar with the standards. And for those of you out there who are thinking, what is PCOB? They are the overall regulators of the auditors, and they have issued all of the audit standards that auditors have to abide by. And in Canada, their equivalent is this outfit called CPAB. But here in Canada, we have our own Canadian auditing standards. And there's differences in the two, to be sure. So always having a handle on what your service providers can actually do is clutch. Shamiz, one final question for you. You touched on this briefly about having the right board and the right board partners. I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, this one's a real touchy one because it really, it could make you or break you. And when an entrepreneur starts a company, he or she really wants to have good advisors at the table, but also want to have advisors at the table that are supportive of the strategic direction that they want to take the business. So, to colloquialize that, you tend to get a lot of yes men, yes persons at the table. But at a certain point in time, you really need to have your board be that constructive, not destructive, but constructive advisor helping you run your business for the better. And too many times I've seen more weak boards than strong boards. And in the short term, you'll be fine. But in the long term, it could be problematic. Even in the context of our IPO readiness discussion today, in terms of them, the board feeling that, I don't want to take all the money. Well, that money might not be there 6 months from now if you don't take it. Or they're too dilution sensitive. Well, once again, you might miss a milestone. Your stock could crater, and then what kind of dilution are you going to get down the road later on? So they got to have some kind of experience at the good and the bad, and bring that to the table in those board meetings, because they are your internal partners. There's more confidential discussions that happen at the board level than with your audit partners and your lawyers. Some companies invite their lawyers to board meetings, other companies don't. So but the board members are at the table. So there needs to be an evolution of your board members as part of that IPO readiness is effectively what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I like, what you touched on in terms of their interactions with founders, because certainly, and for those of us up in our pop culture, you may have watched the Uber documentary Super Pumped. But that's a great example. Uber is a great example. There's several others that are very good examples. WeWork, where founders and boards end up at loggerheads. I was just wondering, Shamiz, if you could comment as to, maybe it goes back to even a shareholders agreement or something, or planning for the futures for founders.
Yeah, those shareholders agreements can be really problematic, and you really gotta get them comfortable with your strategic direction, and try and unwind those if you can. Because give you an example, I remember one agreement we had is that we couldn't we weren't allowed to do any share consolidations or reverse share splits, as some people call them. And that could be problematic if you're trying to list your company on NASDAQ, because as we all know and have seen, when you trade for a certain number of days below $1 per share, you will get that notice from NASDAQ. You have 180 days to get above $1 by whatever means possible, or you will get a delisting notice. And you have to publicly disclose that letter that you would have got from NASDAQ. So one of the quick go-tos, of course, is do that reverse share split. Another way is continue to execute on the business, and hopefully the market appreciates your achievement of milestones. But that's, if it's a bad market, it's a bad market. You might not get there. So you probably want to take the more sure bet of that share consolidation. But if you've got that shareholders, that shareholder agreement that restricts you, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. So I always like keeping as much optionality, and you got to convince your board and your shareholders we have to maintain optionality in everything we do to take advantage of market opportunities when they present themselves. And an example of an optionality I'll give you once you go public. One of the things I have at Ascensa Surgical, and we've had it for the last year, we've got a pretty significant ATM financing facility, an at-the-market financing facility, which we haven't tapped into. It's not a good market, but guess what? If the markets change, I'm ready. I'm ready to execute, and it's all about being ready.
Yeah, and we love our abbreviations. For those that didn't catch that, ATM, it's at the market offering. So it's just a standing prospectus. So when it's available, you can hit the market and, hit the ground running, as opposed to, having to be on that back foot. It allows you to be a little more responsive. Saad, is there anything that you'd add on this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I'll mention is, it's important to have a board that's involved, but also, some members on the board have to be, I would say, financially literate. And what I mean by that is a board member that has had experience with these listings, being a public company, is able to kind of decipher, uh, the company's runway, how much money is required. It just helps from that perspective, because it's another set of eyes for management to run things by if they need any guidance. Oftentimes we come across, boards that financial literacy is somewhat missing, and the board has to rely on management to be able to kind of fill that gap. I just think for a well-run board, you need someone that understands both sides of the coin. And Shamiz is a great example. I think he's an expert from a business perspective and an industry perspective, but he also, from a financial statement perspective or a financial perspective, he knows what he's talking about. He's dealt with it. He's done this a few times, so he'd be a perfect candidate for someone like that.
Awesome. Yeah. And, from having been in the room with those boards, there's a notable difference between people with some financial literacy versus others. Even if they've got a great business acumen, sometimes the nuances will get lost on them, and they might focus on one thing that in the grand scheme of things might not actually be all that relevant. So, well, I thank you guys for the responses there. And, just to kind of bring this together for everybody here. So do you think you're ready? It's a tough question. I think we've probably given you a lot to think about today. I know we ranged from the very basic things like record keeping up to the more complicated things like what you're actually rolling out into a public markets with. But I would say, where MNP can jump in and help you with that is certainly at the minute level, which is our e-service, which is bookkeeping and cloud computing. We've partnered with Xero, and we work with QuickBooks Online, among others, just to perform that back office sort of service and help you actually just get yourself organized. Another key thing out in the market is with respect to tax. Now, there's a tax compliance, there's tax strategy, there's tax planning. Certainly, you want to make sure you have your structures right. But there's also credits available to Canadian tech companies. So, just to highlight a couple: scientific research and experimental development, otherwise known as SHRED, and the Ontario Innovation and Digital Media Tax Credits, OIDMTC. Those credit systems actually allow you to get cash back in your pocket. So those are two that, if you haven't started talking about it and you think you might be in the neighborhood of qualifying for something, if you're creating something, it's a good thing to have somebody just come by and kick the tires on. One of our other services that we find is extremely beneficial, and we talked about this indirectly quite a bit, is our transaction accounting and advisory services, or colloquially known as TAS. It ranges on everything from interpretation of some of these agreements. The agreements you're signing, before you sign them, it might not hurt to have an advisor tell you, how do these things actually work? And what are the implications, be it dilution or just mechanics? Also, in the context of what we talked about with Saad and Shamiz's experience, just having to go from IFRS. So you've done the right thing. You've conducted your audits. You've got your accounting straight under IFRS. But now you've hit this thing, or you think you might hit this thing where all of a sudden you've got to go over to US GAAP. And there's certainly that opportunity to get us involved in an advisory perspective. And just in the overall grand scheme of things, having a set of eyes or a set of hands to help you do some of that heavy lifting from your audit preparedness, I think that's probably the biggest concern you'll have once you get on this sort of precipice of being ready. We also have a wide-ranging suite of relationships, be it the stock exchanges. Saad touched on a few of the Canadian ones earlier, the TSX, TSXV, CSE, and NEO. But we've also got relationships with people in the market, legal counsel that we've worked with before, brokers, and of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out CFO consultants like Shamiz. So certainly, if you're coming out of this conversation today and thinking, hey, I might be ready, or you know what, I just want to talk, I need to think this through, or I've got questions, the first step really is reaching out. That brings us to our Q&A session. So the first one that I see here is, what is the minimum cost of an IPO for the company, and what is the minimal annual revenue recommended to go for an IPO? I think it's two questions in one, so maybe let's focus on cost. And Saad, I'll maybe pick on you first for your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of a loaded question. I think it's there's no kind of standard cost for an IPO. It all depends on the complexity, of the business itself. What the audit effort will be required in order to be able to comply, and then the actual, looking at the actual prospectus that's being filed. We have certain reviews that need to occur, and once again, it depends on the complexity. So, I apologize for not giving an answer, but it all depends on the scenario. I think if you have not a complicated type of business, and the disclosures and the prospectus filing is fairly straightforward, then I think your cost would be lower. But if you have a complicated industry with complex issues from an accounting and audit perspective, then your cost will likely be higher. I think typically, completing an audit for a tech company that has some level of risk, you're looking at somewhere between 70 to 80 grand per year, and then the reviews of the prospectus are on top of that. But that all depends on, once again, the complexity of the engagement in the file itself.
Yeah, and I'd be remiss if I didn't point out the peripheral costs from the lawyers, the advisors.
Yeah.
Shamiz, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this one.
Yeah, no, I think Saad covered it, but one that I'll add that people are kind of forget about until they actually see the quote. And this has become an issue in the last 2 years for companies going public. It first started in the U.S., but it's filtered its way into Canada. D&O insurance premiums have gone through the roof. Reach out to your insurance broker, get quotes, understand what you need to do to try and mitigate that, because it shocked me how much D&O insurance is on both sides of the border. It's in fact, I've heard stories that it has, because the D&O was so significant, it has stopped some companies from pursuing going public.
Yeah.
And that's a great point. And in terms of some of those kind of hidden costs that you might not be aware of when you're looking at this, again, just making sure you talk to your advisor about what some of those costs might be when you're trying to forecast.
And you can get away with that D&O insurance as a private company if your board members and officers are willing to embrace that risk. But I do know of a couple of companies that went public and they still don't have D&O insurance. But remember also that will limit your ability to raise capital with underwriters, with brokers, investment banks, because they want to ensure if there's any problems, there are deep pockets out there that can cover any litigation that might happen from investors if problems happen.
And to Saad's earlier comments about getting those right people on your board, that's going to certainly be a hurdle to potentially recruiting big names or people that you would really want as strategic partners on your board.
Yeah.
Shamiz, what are your thoughts on the second part of the question, the amount of revenue?
It's hilarious because I was an analyst, writing research reports on companies, and I've talked to people who are not really from the investment community, and they ask me that question. So let me get this straight. You got this company, you're recommending them. They should be worth $200 million. They're currently worth $100 million, but they got no revenue. How does that work? And that's really, the biotech world, which we're all probably have some exposure to. And it's about the business plan of that company and ultimately what they're going to achieve, what the risk reward profile is of that company, achieving those milestones, achieving those approved products, the receptivity of that product to be purchased by the market you're targeting, and ultimately what the DCF, the discounted cash flow of that business will be in the future. That's what you're being valued on. So there is no minimal annual revenue. But I say that, and some of the audience might be saying, well, I had some discussions, or I looked on the NASDAQ site. There's this category, you need a certain amount of annual revenue. That's true. But then there are other categories you can pursue that have other obligations, requirements, where you don't have to have the revenue component, but you have to have other components to meet their listing criteria. So there are strategies you can pursue. And you got to get familiar with that in the context of your business.
Excellent. I think that was a great answer. I have another question here for either of you. Not all companies have a Shamiz or can afford a Shamiz. So where does that leave them?
Have a good CPA partner who can kind of provide that expertise to your management team, or help them with regards to, you might want to consider XYZ. The dialogue.
Yeah, I would echo those comments, Shamiz and Will. I think it's a collaborative effort, right? So I think if one side has gone through the process before and the other side has not, it just means you have an advisor that you have to kind of trust and go through. And it's important to ask the right questions and go through these transactions with a fine level of detail, just so that you're learning, but also you're relying on your advisors to be able to guide you. We were obviously very lucky that we had Shamiz on the other side, who was, well versed and knew what he was talking about and knew how these transactions worked. But there's often times where, there is no Shamiz on the other side. But in that particular circumstance, it's just us guiding those companies and helping them through the process, just to make sure it's a no surprise experience and they understand the process. We sometimes get a phone call from a client or a prospective client that says, "Hey, I'd like to go public and I'd like to have it done by next month," right? Uh, and it's just a function of us educating them, saying, "Hey, it's not that easy. It's not a on-off switch. It takes time, and these are the things that are required." So it's a process.
I've got another question here, and if you haven't used these softwares, answer if you like. But do you recommend any of the cap table software, like Carta or ShareWorks or anything like that? Have you used
I'm
them?
embarrassed to say this, but it's the truth. We're always watching costs, and Excel has been my friend all these years and all these different companies. I don't know, Saad, have you had exposure to these software systems?
Yeah, so I think clients kind of vary. So some clients have used Carta or ShareWorks in the past, and other people like Shamiz like use Excel. I think the point is, regardless of which avenue you take, the point is to know your cap table, understand the ins and outs. So even if you are using Carta, that doesn't mean you're not involved and you don't understand the ins and outs of it. It all depends. I think the Excel or companies that do Excel and are organized do a great job of understanding what's involved in the cap table. It gets updated in a timely fashion, and it just helps the auditors and any kind of reporting requirements that the company has go smoothly. Carta and ShareWorks can also do that, but it's not a dribble handoff where you just engage them and you don't have to worry about it.
Fair enough. And I think, underlying all of this is making sure somebody's actively managing the cap table.
Yeah.
Nothing's being missed, because I know we've had deals that get derailed by somebody saying, "Oh, hey, we forgot about these prefs that we issued." And, there's nothing that people hate more than hearing something like that. Investors, auditors, and everyone. The next question I had in the chat here was, how can I best communicate my company's message to investors? Shamiz, I think maybe that's a good question for you.
Yeah, it is an evolving area. It really is. I remember when I first started getting involved in the capital markets, it was, and it still is a big part of it. It's about news releases, having the right news release flow. But there are so many other distribution channels to reach out to investors now. Um, there used to be bulletin boards, and now there are lots of rules around companies being involved in bulletin boards, because that could be problematic. So the rules changed on that, but there was a time when companies were even kind of communicating with investors on bulletin boards. And then I remember, this was probably 12, 13 years ago, Facebook became popular, and companies were actually using Facebook as a communication tool. And now it's kind of, Facebook is not as popular, and LinkedIn is a very popular tool. And I know that they use to communicate with investors, things that are not material, that are not under the U.S. SEC's requirements of regulation, full disclosure, because you would have to still issue a news release with regards to those. But they're incremental things, interesting things to note, to help you understand what your company's up to, what conferences the medical conferences they're presenting at, and things like that. We use LinkedIn for that. But what I've also heard and been observing is some companies are starting to pivot to things like even TikTok, to use that as a platform. Whether that becomes the next Facebook, I don't know, but you just got to constantly be monitoring the different distribution channels. We still maintain through our website a proprietary email distribution list that we maintain contact with investors with, so they get our news releases. They don't have to be part of a newswire service. They when we present at conferences, or they get our quotes at the end of the day, so we keep top of mind with those investors. It's noisy out there. It's noisier than it's ever been, and you have to continually reevaluate your methods for communicating with current investors and potential investors. And I would say it's probably more important to reach out to potential investors, because the current investors, once they hit a price point on your stock, they're going to sell your stock because they made their money, and they're going to sell to someone who really doesn't know that much about your company. Or at least you want them to be excited about your company and hopefully hold on to your stock a lot longer because they've bought into your mission vision of your company, which you have communicated to them previously.
Excellent. Great points. So this is more a question for you. It says, I've heard a bit about Reg A filings in the US. What does that mean? Is there anything similar in Canada? So,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely a question that we come across. So, Reg A filings are with companies trying to sell shares into the U.S. It's not as onerous as a typical prospectus. It's something that we kind of come across. I would say over the last 6 months, probably done one or two. From an equivalent standpoint in Canada, I'm not sure if there is one. To be honest, I think typically in Canada, the way people raise money is filing prospectuses and perhaps going public, like we're talking about now. Um, yeah, it's just another avenue for you to be able to raise money into the U.S. That's how I would describe it. It's less
yeah,
onerous, but it is an avenue. Yeah.
yeah, I've been seeing variations of it. I've certainly seen people sniffing around the opportunity because, as you said, it's relatively low barrier. And
Yeah.
I know there's the tiered system. You can raise up to 20 million in the first tier, 75 million in the second tier, and it's got fairly lax regulatory implications for you. I know it often gets confused with the crowdfunding regulations. There's a whole separate suite of that. So going back to the right advisor can help you really get through that. I know Canada has existing exemptions, but they're generally for insiders and accredited investors. There has recently been an inside. You'll recall this from our recent conference, but there has been certain changes suggested and put out there that might be coming down the pipeline to permit a certain level of capital raising from non-accredited investors.
Yeah.
But like it's very TBD at this point. Nobody's certain where that's necessarily going to end up. There's another question in here. I think it touches upon Shamiz the point of about revenue, and just the question is, how do I know if my company's big enough to gain traction in the public markets?
Yeah, that's one of those intangible questions. And if you're planning to go public, you need to actually interact with the public before you go public to know what the appetite is and get a sense of if they truly see the value that management sees in the company. You think you're $1 billion company, but does the outside world truly think that? Or are they aware of other things in terms of the competitive environment you've kind of you believe are not issues for yourself? And if in fact you truly believe they're not issues for yourself, but you haven't disclosed why they're not issues because of um, competitive points that you want to keep proprietary, then that might limit your ability to go public at the valuation you want. So you have to weigh that. When you go public, you do have to disclose a lot more than if you stayed private. So it's not a straightforward question to answer, unfortunately. The more you disclose, the more you can show the value of your company. But the more you disclose, the more you've shown your cards to your competitors.
I think it also comes back to like having a CFO that has a solid network and even a board member or board members that have a Rolodex where they can put you in contact with certain investors. There's conferences that you can attend just to get a pulse of if there is traction, if there is an appetite for your type of company, what you're offering, what your plans are. I think that goes a long way, and it kind of makes in-grounds for the future, right? In the future, if you do want to kind of call upon those investors or those conversations, it helps.
Yeah, and it's not just the investors. I know sometimes it's really hard. Even I'm challenged. I spend a lot of effort to try and get the attention of those investors, and because they get inundated with phone calls and emails and so forth. But even approaching multiple bankers and using them as your proxy for the underlying people with money who would invest in your company, and getting a barometer read from multiple investment bankers, that is useful to do as well too, and that costs you nothing. Talk to the bankers.
Thanks, guys. Unfortunately, we're out of time for any additional questions, but thank you to everyone that all the participants that submitted those questions. After today's presentation, we'll circulate some quick hit takeaways for public markets liquidity events. But thank you again for your attendance. And if your question didn't get answered today, certainly do not hesitate to get in touch with us.